right, all right, all right, all right. All right, here it is, the ultimate. No, that's a bit over the top. The epic. No, that's a bit of an oversell. My adequate / sufficient assembly table. Now, this is a torsion box setup. It's got a T-track all the way around, 20mm dog holes on the top. It's built to be mobile. With the unscrewing of some knobs, this whole thing slides off and can go right into the bed of my truck. It's also built to be integrated with the VacPad system by Kouro's Carpentry, and I'll show you all about how that works. It also sits atop this 9-drawer Husky tool cabinet with soft close slides to store tools, accessories, snacks, etc. So let's get to it. Let me show you how I built it and why I built it the way I did. And if I keep banging on this table, it's bound to keep your attention. Probably not. All right, first up, I headed over to my buddy Mike's shop at Veteran Wood Co. to employ the use of his CNC machine to cut all the dog holes in this HDF material, which you've seen me use this before. HDF has a high-density MDF skin on a poplar plywood core. I had Mike cut 2 of these for me, one for the top and the bottom. Unfortunately, the first one he cut, it was bad measurements on my hand, so it's a little short, but that's okay, we'll fix that later. And then back at my shop, while Lola was fast asleep, I needed to figure out the dimensions of my torsion box innards because I wanted my outfeed table for my table saw to be the same height as this assembly table. And I accidentally used my metric ruler, but still was able to get an accurate measurement. And then I cut a couple of test pieces, brought it back to the table, slid it under the level in varying spots to make sure it was going to work, and then I checked the other side to make sure it's level all the way across. And once I had that, I ripped a bunch of strips off camera, or forgot to turn on the camera, as it were. So I'm using 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood for the torsion box skeleton, but for the ends and the sides, I'm using 3/4-inch ply. I have some white oak plywood, and over at the miter saw, I can start cutting that 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood for the inner skeleton parts. Yeah, I'll take a little stack of these. Nope, not those. Yep, take these. No, wait, I need those. Okay. And then I can start laying them out in a rib-like 2x4 wall framing fashion. Once I had those cut, I needed to work on the outer frame of the table, which is going to accept a 3/4-inch T-track on all 4 sides. So on my table saw, using the dado stack, I do just that, cut a nice, even groove on all pieces, and then confirm the T-track fits in there nicely, which is good. Stand back, pause for a moment. Now, since the T-track runs continuously on all 4 sides of the table, I also needed to cut a groove in the ends of the outer pieces. And to do this safely, I clamped a bunch of pieces together to give me a nice thick block, and then ran it over the dado stack and got some nice tear out. How you like that? I don't, actually. Now, the keen observer may notice that my ends are doubled up. Why? Well, because I cut those long sides a little too short. No worries. There are always scrap pieces around to lend a hand when you need them to. So with some glue and some screws, I attach the ends to the side, and then, let's whip this thing around like a wooden haysickle and play festool drill bowling. And then I can screw and glue the other long section in to those end pieces, and now we're starting to see a little progress here. But to be honest, that was the easy part. Now we start on the torsion box inner skeleton assembly. Now, most videos you see on torsion boxes will have these first ribs run parallel to the long side, not to the short side like I have here. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough long material, so I had to do it this way and then fill in all the little pieces. I don't know if this will have any effect on the flatness over time of the table, so it's just something to take into consideration. Now I'm using some spacers to make sure each of these ribs is the same distance apart from one another, and the key aspect to this whole torsion box is these pieces all need to be exactly the same width and sit flush on the top and bottom. That is what's going to give you a perfectly flat surface. And then I just continue on using that same method, using my spacer blocks, some glue, and some brad nails, and make my way until I reach the end, making sure that piece is flush with the top, and then remove those spacer blocks and wipe off any squeeze out that may have squeezed out. Then back at the miter saw, I cut all my little pieces for the rib skeleton using a stop block, making sure they're all the same length. This is some serious production here. Oh boy. So my first method of attack for these was pocket screws. So with my Craig jig, I pocket screwed a bunch of pocket holes in a lot of my pieces, and then with some glue and some pocket screws and my right angle drill attachment, because there was no way I was getting in there without that, I was able to start securing these mini ribs in each section. I also used some spacer blocks as I did on the other ribs to make sure everything is evenly spaced. And as you can see, I went right for the brad nail. What I realized was drilling a pocket hole in one side and then coming at it from the other side as well, they kind of meet in the middle and butt heads, or tips as it were. So I decided to pocket screw one side and then I brad nailed the other. You can also offset those ribs so you have full access to both sides for the brad nailer instead of having to toe nail one side. And then many hours later, what felt like weeks, I was finally done with the last piece and I could clean up and prepare ourselves to put on the top and the bottom. Now first I throw up the top here because what I wanted to do was put just a little chamfer on all those holes just to ease those edges when you're putting in the dog so it doesn't break that sharp edge. So as you can see here with the extreme close-up, a nice little chamferous profile. Now to seal the underside of the top, I'm just putting a quick coat of shellac on here because this dries so fast. Basically by the time I get to the end, it's already dry. And then I can flip it over and prep this thing to be emblazoned with my logo. So I use a little water just to moisten the surface, and then using my heat-controlled brand provided by Gearhart Industries. Woohoo! Smokin'! Now, Gearhart makes the toughest, highest quality custom branding irons in the world right here in the USA. So if you want to check them out and all the types of brands they make, I'll put a link in the description below. And it looks so nice, I decided to do it twice at the other end of the table. All right, enough about me. It's time for some Total Boat, baby. Using Halcyon Clear, I'm going to hit this with a few coats of gloss and then a couple coats of satin on top of that. This is a water-based product. I'll have a link below if you'd like to check it out. It also is recoatable in about an hour. Oops, realize here that a foam brush isn't that efficient. So let's go to the pan and the roller and see if we can speed up the process by a few hours. Yep, that did the trick. One coat done. Now I also needed to get on the inside of those dog holes, but this isn't really a family-friendly operation, so we'll forget that. Now I just want to show you that the dog's fitting there a little bit tight because that water-based coating raised the grain. So wrap some sandpaper around a drill, and now we have a nice fit. And after that first coat was dry, I gave it a quick sanding with 220, and then it was off to the races again with the second coat using the roller. And as I mentioned before, I gave it another coat of gloss and then 2 coats of satin, and then that was done. I also put a couple coats on the bottom, which you can see here, to seal that. Now what I'm doing is I'm using a straight edge just to mark my lines where that rib skeleton is underneath. So when I glue it and nail it, I nail it in the proper position. So with that bottom removed, I can place glue on every available surface. All right, you get the idea. And then with the accuracy of a football striker, I place that right where it needs to be and start popping in some 18 gauge brad nails. I start on the front perimeter to get that buttoned up. And then in the middle, I'm going to use screws. Just in case this thing had a little bit of a cup, those pin nails probably aren't going to drive it down flat. So pre-drilling for some holes, and then I can drive some screws. And then I just decided to use screws everywhere to make sure that panel got pulled down nice and tight and flat. So you may remember at the beginning of the show I mentioned one of the panels I cut was too short, so in order to fix that, I'm just filling in with some small pieces, some glue, some screws, and that'll be underside, so you'll never see it. Then I gave that a light sanding to make sure everything was flush, and I hit it with another coat of the Halcyon before flipping the whole thing over. As you can see here, under the watchful eye of that cooling fan, which magically turned off on its own there. Now I will not be gluing the top on. I'm just going to use screws to secure it. In the event that I ever need to change this, it gets so beat up, then I can just unscrew it and pop on a new one. And then it was another session of screw palooza as I made my way around the perimeter, countersinking and dropping all these screws in. And to keep my holes consistently spaced, instead of marking out every single one of them, I marked out a strip of them on this green piece of tape. And then once I screwed one line in, I could move it over to the next and run my screws through those holes again. And sometime later, I finally made it to the end where I deposited the last 2 screws in the appropriate holes. Oh, and I guess we're sanding again in preparation for another coat of finish. Now, what I've seen a lot of people do is cut the top oversized and then come around with a flush trim bit. I didn't do that because I wanted a perfect fit, but it was just a hair off, so I ended up using a flush trim bit just to nip off a few little slivers here and there. And to add even more personalization to my bench, I'm using the Owlhead Woodco Medallion Maker. So with a pattern bit and the supplied template, which you can choose either a 3-inch or a 2-inch medallion, I'm hollowing out all the area in between, and then I'll clean all that dust, schmutz, and chips out of there, and then come back for one final pass to make sure I have a nice, clean circumference around the outside. Now you can get these medallions cut in any species you want. I chose walnut, of course. It also adds a nice little contrast with that top. So all you need is a little bit of glue and a decent eye for alignment to make sure it's not all cockeyed, or use a square like I did. And then just a mallet and a little tap, tap, taparoo. You have a nice tight fit. Now it was time to hide all those obscene-looking plywood edges around the outside of the assembly table. And typically people would probably take some 3/4-inch material and frame the whole thing, but I didn't want to add more weight to this thing. So I bought some walnut veneer, peel and stick, off of Amazon. Thought I'd give this a try for the first time. And as you can see, Jerry is super excited about it. So with a straight edge and a sharp knife, I make my first incision and cut a strip. I peel back some of the protective backing and start veneering, as it were. And then I grab my little speed roller to get some nice contact, but I read the instructions after I did all this and it said not to use that, to actually just use kind of a piece of wood and burnish it to get it to stick a little better. I'm not really sure what the difference would be, but anyway, once that was on, I trimmed the edges, and I typically don't like to use these little veneer trimmers because they tend to grab the grain and possibly tear it, but it worked. And then to clean out the waste in that T-track groove, I used a flush trim bit, which I do not recommend because that adhesive is on that veneer and it is very sticky and sticks to your bit and gums it all up. So I would find another way, maybe just use a utility knife. And with all 4 sides done, I could plunk it down. And you may have noticed I have another countertop underneath. This was like an IKEA countertop, but what I wanted to do was keep that there. That way, when I take this one out on the road, I still have a work surface to work from if I come back to the shop. Then it was on to applying some finish to all this veneer just to seal that walnut up. I'm actually just using shellac here because, as I mentioned before, it dries so fast. By the time I get to the end, it's dry, so I put about 4 or 5 coats for protection. And then I could put on the final coat of the Total Boat Halcyon satin finish and really bring out the beauty in that MDF top layer. Yeah, right. And then it was time to glue in the T-track, and I'm using the Total Boat High Performance Epoxy here. Generally, the screws you use to affix this just aren't strong enough, in my opinion, for any kind of longevity or strength, so I like to epoxy these things in to make sure they're not going to move. Apparently, it was a bit of a tight fit down there. Needed a mallet. Watch your hand. Oh, whew. I could put in the other piece at this end, which appeared to be just as tight for some reason. Must not have trimmed that veneer enough. And then with some number 6 3/4-inch screws, I secure the track and embed it into that epoxy. All right, next up, I wanted to work on some accessories for the VacPad system that I showed you in the intro. So over at the bandsaw, oh baby, over at the spindle sander, we got ear cam. That's a new feature everyone is sure to love. So once I get that smoothed out, and then over with the trim router, kind of round over those edges to smooth those out. And over at the drill press, I'll drill some holes for that knob to kind of recess into, and I'll show you why I did that. But then I could mount this to the actual VacPad, and be sure to check the link in the description below, Kouro Carpentry's website. You can go to the VacPad and look at all the amazing accessories and options that he offers. And with the VacPad mounted, I could insert some T-bolts and screw on some knobs, and then slide her on in that T-track, tighten her down, insert the air supply into the VacPad, and sticks. Look at that. That's not going anywhere. Use the foot pedal to release the air, and it releases the workpiece. Super strong and completely eliminates the need for clamps. And here's why I had to recess those knobs into the actual accessory I made. That way the workpiece clears the knob and doesn't interfere with the vacuum suction. Now, my original thinking on how to affix this assembly table to that sub countertop and still make it easy to take off and transport was to put a registration pin or two and then come up from the bottom, with threaded knobs into threaded inserts. So for the registration pins, I drilled some 20mm holes, and then since I didn't have a 20mm dowel, I went over to the lathe and turned one down out of some walnut, and then trimmed them down to length at the miter saw. And for the threaded inserts and knobs, I used this mega long 3/8 of an inch drill bit to go all the way through the bottom and through that countertop. And then using some of that 4-minute epoxy, I could secure the threaded inserts in the countertop below, and then position the table by dropping it on that registration pin we made before, line it up with the front, slide it back into place, and then using some threaded knobs, I could secure one in the front, one in the back, and then I also did 2 others on the other end. All right, so this isn't a video about the VacPad system specifically, but I want to show you a couple ways I'm integrating it into this bench to make my workflow and my work holding much easier. There's infinite possibilities with this system, so I'm really just exploring it, but here's a couple ways I'm integrating it. The way this system works is I have a small air compressor on the floor over here, air tube coming out attached to a foot pedal, and then an air supply coming out here with a diverter going to this pad and this pad. You can have multiple pads with multiple tubes and multiple diverters going to different places. So this one specifically, I wanted to hold pieces that I need to maybe plane the edge on, like this, and it needs to be held vertical. So trying to do that on a bench or clamping to the side of the bench becomes very difficult. And the same thing with this, if I needed to stick this here and route around an edge or sand one edge, and rather than have this thing slide all over the bench. So here's something cool I want to show you. This is a mini router table for a trim router, cordless trim routers, and I'm actually going to do a video specifically on this coming up, and I'm going to be giving one of these away. I designed it, I built it, and I'm going to give one away. But it's also designed to work with the VacPad system. So I can just clamp it on there, do whatever I have to do, route an edge, and let's say, oh no, I forgot to do something to a piece. If I have another VacPad over here, I can put it on here, do whatever I need to do, and then come back here. And then to release this, and hit the foot pedal, and it releases it. So strong enough to hold a full router with a battery, a fence, a table, and it's nice and sturdy. So hopefully that gives you a little glimpse on what this system can do with just a little bit of air. It's pretty amazing. And I guess that kind of wraps this whole project up. So I'm pretty excited to have this assembly table over here. It's going to give me another work surface separate from my assembly / outfeed table in front of my table saw, and plenty of horizontal surface to store junk, which is already happening here.